Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. Today, I am very privileged to welcome as a guest Mobeen Vaid. You are most welcome, Mobeen Vaid.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Mobeen is a Muslim public intellectual and writer who focuses on how traditional Islamic frames of thinking intersect the modern world. He has authored a number of pieces on Islamic sexual and gender norms, including an article entitled, "Can Islam Accommodate Homosexual Acts? Quranic Revisionism and the Case of Scott Kugel," and a piece entitled, "And the Male is Not Like the Female, Sunni Islam and Gender Nonconformity." Both articles are published in the Muslim Matters website. His other articles can be found on his fascinating website, Occasional Reflections, which I'll link to below. I recently discovered his website, and there's some fascinating nuggets there. I do recommend people have a look at. So moving on to the first of the subjects, the Quran itself mentions sex between men several times, almost all of them in the context of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, in which the city inhabitants demand sexual relations with the messengers sent by God to the prophet Lot, or Lut, as is known in Arabic. The Quranic story is almost the same as the version in the Bible. Now, the Quran is understood by Islamic scholars to be condemning liwat. That's an Arabic word meaning sodomy, or specifically anal intercourse between men. Some Western writers, however, disagree and say it is wrong to equate what they see as a rape story with modern homosexual relationships. Now, I know Mobeen has written very extensively about this subject. So what is your view?
Yes, so Bismillah. I'll just mention a couple of things related to what you've spoken about. I think most of the Quranic revisionism dovetails off of biblical revisionism. And so the playbook is essentially the same in terms of the types of arguments that are being formulated to question the Quranic account. The challenge that I see for them is, one, certainly the type of biblical revisionism that's been done over the years has been much more thoroughgoing. Christians in general, especially, especially when one starts taking into account the different denominations that are out there, have a more complicated relationship to Scripture, and the degree to which many groups view their Scripture as malleable or simply, good wisdom, but not something that they are necessarily bound to the letter. Right, to the letter is a very, very different thing than how Muslims view the Quran. In addition to that, the Quran itself does not incorporate and include a lot of the details the Bible does. Certainly on the question of Sodom and Gomorrah, what you have is the Prophet Lot, or the Prophet Lut, who in just about every single time in the Quran he and his people are mentioned, the issue at stake is the issue of same-sex sexual behavior, specifically sodomy, the issue of sodomy, where you have men that are approaching lustfully and with sexual desire other men. إِنَّكُمْ لَتَأْتُونَ رِجَالَ شَهْوَةً مِّن دُونِ النِّسَاءِ, as Allah says, that you approach with sexual desire and lust other men instead of women. And so the language of the Quran is pretty clear. In fact, I don't know of a phrasing or a description of that particular act that could have been any clearer. And so the efforts to revise the Quranic narrative and what's been plainly understood by every single Muslim group since the advent of Islam, without any dispute or disagreement, to me is a high stakes affair. Because once you revise that, you can revise anything. In fact, it's one of the more difficult things to reform. By comparison, there are plenty of other things that we consider to be essential to the faith that would be a lot easier to try to revise once that hermeneutic is accepted as a reasonable way of reading Scripture. So.
Mm-hmm. I noticed in my discussions with Professor John Barton, who's professor of the Bible at the University of Oxford, he agreed that the Bible condemns liwat, or sodomy. However, he personally does not feel in any way bound to accept that verdict at all.
Sure.
He says, well, that's what people then thought. Today in modern Britain, we think differently, and I'm going to follow that view. Now that's obviously not a procedure that, as you say, Muslims can follow at all. For Muslims, the Quran is the speech of God himself, and that option is not available. But yeah, there is a very much more complicated relationship with Christians.
Many modern Christians have created this dichotomy between the biblical text and a certain personality profile that they have crafted around the person of Jesus, right? And so when those two things come into tension, they tend to relent to Jesus as this overarching figure who personifies love and compassion and empathy and inclusion and care and concern, all of that, over a text that has been, contributed to over the ages by a handful of men that had their own prejudices and biases, and that has some wisdoms here and there, but should be looked at more as a text with useful wisdoms, but not as something that has to definitively determine how our lives are going to be guided, or instruct us on real clear questions of morality. I mean, that type of approach to the Bible seems to me to be increasingly parochialized to more, rigid Christian communities, minoritarian strands that still sort of adhere to the Christian faith more strictly. But I think broadly, most Christians don't have that type of relationship with the Bible, and what they've done is that they've put this new sort of figurative Jesus in a place of primacy over all else. And so I'm not surprised to hear that. I mean, that's kind of been my relationship. In fact, even people over the years, people I've worked with or people I've met, when I ask them about this issue, they'll kind of, a lot of times I'm actually surprised at how often I'll get these cynical replies. The Bible says a lot of things, right? Yeah. I'm going to follow the Bible on everything. I'm going to be doing all of these otherwise absurd and outlandish things, and I'm going to have to like we all get it, right? That tends to be the type of narrative that I get from them. So
yeah, okay. I mean, you've summed up the Quranic position, but I've heard hadith that these are sayings or pronouncements of the Prophet allegedly addressing this. I say allegedly because I've heard from some people there's some dispute about whether or not these are reliable hadith or not. Can they be used even in this discourse?
Yes, so there are a variety of hadith from the Prophet ﷺ that do speak to the actions of the people of Lot. A number of them are subject to disagreement, and so you do have, especially I'd say that the core hadith that a lot of people differ over is a hadith that's cited in works of fiqh when it comes to addressing the question of whether or not sodomy has a clear had crime or penalty associated with it, which is to say, is there a divinely ordained punishment that's prescribed for it, the same way that there is for adultery or fornication, the same way that there is for theft, the same way that there is for murder, even apostasy, right? The question is does that penalty exist for sodomy? And there is a hadith that has been reported from the Prophet ﷺ that a person who engages in sodomy should be killed. It's a capital crime. Both the active and the passive participant, al-fa'il wal-maf'ul bihi. That particular hadith is subject to a wide-ranging disagreement. It's not the only proof. Now, the majority of scholars do, in fact, say that there is a had penalty to it. A minority of scholars say there isn't. Ibn Hazm, a lot of the Hanafis and others say that there isn't. One, because they don't accept the reliability or veracity of the hadith. They say it's an unreliable transmission. And then in addition to that, they'll say that you cannot establish a had penalty on the basis of analogical reasoning.
Yeah, that's the Hanafi position, obviously.
Yeah, and the analogical reasoning bit has to do with whether or not a person can create an analogy based on a had penalty that exists elsewhere. So they'll say if fornication, if adultery is a capital crime, well, sodomy is worse than adultery, right? They'll say that that's worse than adultery, and so if there is some evidentiary basis, right? There's for adultery 4 witnesses and all of that. If there's some evidentiary threshold that has been met, it should be subject to the same punishment, given the fact that it is worse than adultery. And Hanafis and others will say, well, that's an inherently subjective measure to say that something is better or worse. And in any event, without clear and unequivocal proof texts in scripture, either from the Quran or from the Prophet's sayings, you can't establish a had penalty whole cloth just based on that type of reasoning. And so again, it's an issue over which there's dispute. That's where you get a lot of the hadith disagreement. There are other narrations that are also subject to some disagreement, although these ones are probably less contentious. These relate to a question or a chapter in fiqh that's called qadhf, which is slanderous accusation. And so certain forms of slanderous accusation in Islamic law are subject to discretionary punishments, right? The idea being that you cannot, in any society, let alone the Islamic one, just freely accuse people of high crimes in a totally slanderous, libelous capacity with no proof, no evidence. You're just doing so to disparage and smear them reputationally and to impugn their integrity. And when that's done, judges have a fair amount of discretion to punish those types of activities or statements, right, made against other people. And so there is a statement from the Prophet ﷺ that's reported where if someone is called a sodomite, right, then he should be punished for slanderous accusation with a certain penalty.
Well, what is the penalty out of interest for that kind of slander?
I want to say that the report talks about something like lashings. Yeah, I want to say that.
Lashings, or so, that's what I heard.
Something like that. Yeah, something like that. But again, that report is subject to disagreement, and so. But again, it's less contentious in general. Overall, when we're talking about ta'zir or discretionary punishments, that's the type of thing that judges had a lot of discretion over, and discretionary punishments were almost always corporal punishments, and so they were physical punishments. But how much, or how many lashings in general, was always sort of at the discretion of the judge, and depending on the nature of the crime and all that. Right?
Exactly. I think it's important just to stress for any viewers who may be unclear: Islam has never and does not advocate simply attacking gay people and punishing them and so on.
In fact,
that require the evidence and very high threshold of evidence in terms of witnesses and so on, and also an emphasis on not implementing hudud punishments. People don't often appreciate that, and it's not a question of just victimizing gay people. That's not the agenda anyway of the Sharia.
Yeah, in fact, one can actually look at the discourse on slanderous accusation as being a very strong caution against the rhetoric that might insinuate what type of people others are, right? Yeah. And so you have in fact very strong reports of even early individuals who look at someone who might be a little bit effeminate, for instance, a man who has some effeminacy to him, and then this is in the presence of a great scholar like Atba and others, who are sort of early successors. So they're the first generation after the generation of the Prophet ﷺ, and someone sits in their midst and says, hey, that guy's effeminate, right? He may be a mukhannath, he may be an effeminate male. And, the scholar really comes down on him very hard. I mean, we're talking about some of the strongest censures a scholar can say, and a very strict reprimand over statements like that. And in fact, those are the types of statements that are oftentimes included as well in these chapters on qadhf, on slanderous accusation.
What we're talking about here, so you've got a man, and there are effeminate men, obviously. Sure. It's not a slander to say that they exist. So Are you saying that this person who was a male, an effeminate male, was being abused or spoken of in a disparaging way? And that
the idea is that you're classifying them in a particular way that could be viewed as offensive, right? As opposed to just making a descriptive observation. Right? A descriptive observation. You're describing them in offensive terms, right? And that's why even in various hadith and even verses in the Quran, you have things or people that are described in certain ways. You have a hadith of a man called Dhul Yadayn, where I believe he had asked a question about the prayer. He mentioned something about the prayer to the Prophet ﷺ, and the man with two hands. And you have, in fact, in the Quran, In the Quran, you have the blind man, Abdullah ibn Maktum, may Allah be pleased with him, radiallahu anh, who was described in Surah Abasa in one of the chapters of the Quran as the blind man. Anja'ahul a'ma, the blind man came to him, right? Now, if a person's, and you had scholars who, for instance, had impediments, al-a'raj, al-a'mash, right? They had limbs and things like that. And so they were described using those terms, but they were descriptive terms. They weren't terms that were used to impugn or disparage or insult them. If a term is obviously deployed and weaponized in that manner, right, then it becomes something that is reprehensible, right?
Right.
Morally and ethically, right? And so that's sort of a different category of area. But the reason I bring this up is that, just calling somebody a sodomite, right? Or calling someone or accusing someone of being an adulterer or a fornicator and things like that were not small things, right? Or the son of or a daughter of a fornicator, an adulterer, right? Or a bastard, right? I mean, these types of accusations were taken quite seriously the history of Islam. So the idea of just insinuating someone as having acted on certain or participating in certain transgressions against God were not small things to do. And so you're right, this sort of witch hunt environment was never in place, such that a person who simply felt sexual attraction towards certain people wasn't, constantly, anxious, right, about people, speculating about their sexual attraction, right? I mean, that just wasn't the environment.
And indeed, in Islam traditionally, well, in Islam as such, I should say, there is no this identification of people by their sexual orientation. So,
of course,
there's there's a lesbian, there's a bisexual, there's a heterosexual. These categorizations, which are they not a relatively recent Western, European American product, are simply not part of the Islamic framework in categorizing people according to identities like that.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, so there's some scholarly difference as to the original sort of genesis of the sexual orientation or the sexual identity and the creation of that. A lot of people trace it to folks like Foucault, the history of sexualities. Yeah. There are others that trace the history a little bit earlier. Some place it in late 18th, early 19th century Germany, as a sort of sociological product. But whatever the case is, it's clear that it's very, very recent. Right. This even notion of a person being a heterosexual or being straight. Right. So it's not just the creation of homosexuality, it's the creation of heterosexuality. Right. The idea that you just have somebody who is irreducibly defined by a certain sexual desire that is immutable, essential to their sense of selfhood, pivotal to their identity and sense of self and everything else. I mean, that's a very, very recent phenomenon. Certainly doesn't predate the modern world. In fact, one of the things that I bring up in the Kugel article is how scholars in the past used to write about pedophilic interests, right, and pedophilic desires. And, it was not seen as pathological for an adult male to feel sexual attraction for an adolescent boy. It was something that was warned against. It certainly wasn't something that was accommodated or tolerated in fiqh or made permissible in Islam or anything like that. It was prohibited outright. But many scholars wrote about it as something that, men had to be on guard against, as something that was eminently possible, right? And not only possible for psychologically disordered human beings, but for people who simply felt a particular temptation and needed to be reminded not to act on it, right? And I think that's important, that they didn't create sort of, and it was, at certain points in Islamic history, it was the type of transgression and, moral crime that became a little bit more common and was sort of evident in certain places. And in spite of that, you didn't have the creation of a category, right? Like a sexual identity was not created around those people, right? You didn't have the pathologizing rhetoric that took place. What you had was a narrative and dialogical space that very much focused on the reality of acts and cautioned and warned and spoke against the severity and enormity of those particular acts and did not try to police the subjective desires of individuals or speculate about what other people's desires were, right? Right.
So in some ways it was, I don't mean to be misunderstood here, but in some ways it was more tolerant. By tolerant, I don't mean tolerant of sin or the crime, but in terms of, there wasn't this persecutory zeal towards groups of people who were then targeted, and people weren't, as you say, policed and investigated carefully about this, that, and the other, about aspects of their lives. There was a much more tolerant, relaxed, but nevertheless there was this clear boundary sense of rightness.
Yeah, I think there was some appreciation of the fact that human beings do feel sexual desires towards, the sexual desire is very, very difficult to govern and discipline. That disciplining sexual desire is one of the primary responsibilities of the believer, and that responsibility is shared across all individuals, irrespective of where their desires take them. Right. Yeah. And so in some ways it was more egalitarian, right? In speaking about those desires. Now it addressed different types of desires, but it addressed those desires as possible phenomena, right? And it spoke about them with severity and strength and muscle and all of that. But it didn't create human categories around different types of transgressions, right? It didn't say, well, a person who commits adultery is now like that person is just, or someone who is inclined towards adultery is himself an adulterer simply through that desire. It needs to be identified that way, and that is like a mental sickness and this and that. It's like, no, this is something that a person needs to try to remedy within themselves. They need to govern that desire. It may be a desire that never goes away for them, right? They may run across plenty of women in their lives that they feel sexually attracted to and interested in having sex with in a unsanctionable capacity or way, right, or context. And yet that's impermissible, major sin in the eyes of God. And a person who does that be held accountable for it. And so, you have all of the hadith and ayat that'll be brought up and statements of scholars and others, right, warning a person against acting on their base and lowly desires. And that is something that I think is important, because it's the same message for all human beings, right? And I think in that way, it is something that is somewhat more freeing for the individual who feels same-sex desires, because from the outset, you're not trying to negotiate your identity. You're not internalizing your desires as your self-definition. You're not building a psychosocial profile off of that identity, such that my desires are now deciding or driving how I view the world, what my politics are, what my relationship to my faith is, the way I see scripture and revelation, the way I interact with other people in my own community, that I suddenly begin to become uncomfortable and insecure about even going to the mosque or about meeting other Muslims. I don't get estranged from my own family, right? Like all these things don't have to happen right away. Like they're not, they're not inevitable outcomes of a person simply feeling a certain type of sexual desire. And so in that way, you're right. I mean, it certainly is a different social phenomenon, right? And the type of person who participates and lives in that type of setting, I think, has a much easier time reconciling themselves to their faith than someone in the modern world, where at the first hint of same-sex sexual attraction, the overriding question that abounds in the mind of that person, right? The sort of singular psychological fixation is, am I gay? And that is the question that they have to wrestle with, and they continue to wrestle with until they find the courage to come out, right? And at that point, all of the entailments of the gay identity become a core part of that person, right? And now we're dealing with a person who really is going to have a very tough time in their life finding God, right? And really having a meaningful relationship with the Prophet ﷺ, loving Islam, right? Which is obviously what we want them to do. So. I think.
I appreciate what you're saying there, but one of the complicating factors, is it not, in today's setting, cultural, political setting in the United States, to a lesser extent here, perhaps in Britain, maybe in Europe as well, is the existence of prominent Muslim leaders, politicians, activists, writers, academics, and so on, who either give the appearance or explicitly endorse the LGBT agenda, gay marriage, the whole thing. And I'm not going to mention names because they're well known. But there do appear to be some who are at best ambiguous or at worst, as I say, explicitly endorsing this very agenda. And they have huge, public profile. These represent the Muslims in the United States, in Britain, whatever. Virtually all of our Muslim MPs, I think, in Britain, for example, voted for gay marriage. Muslim MPs voted for gay marriage in Britain, to give just one example. And so this is a complicating factor. There's no longer, the Muslim person amongst the Ummah dealing with these issues. They have leaders from within who are promoting this agenda, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have it much worse off here in the United States than you all do in the UK. One of the things that's very interesting is that a lot of the Muslims who I have been in touch with, who have same-sex attraction and are really committed to the faith and are always, it's a constant struggle for them, right? One of the things that they always mention as exacerbating that struggle is the position that many of these Muslim leaders have taken. Right? They feel, a lot of them harbor an immense amount of hostility and anger towards them. Even contempt for them and what they've done. I myself obviously differ profoundly with the political calculations that they've made. And in fact, inshallah, I do have a piece that I've written that hopefully will come out in the next 2 months. We'll see where it gets published, but it'll be on LGBT politics in particular, taking on this issue about what's happened in the United States and the West, specifically focused in the United States. But I think part of the problem here has been that so many of our political decisions have been made on the assumption of what is going to be appealing to a certain class of young Muslims, and that we don't want to estrange them, we don't want to alienate them. Especially I think Donald Trump was an accelerant for this type of political calculus, right? Even if there was room in the United States pre-Donald Trump for non-liberal politics, I think his election basically shut the door on that, more or less. And now what you had was this very frenetic atmosphere, especially in Muslim spaces, where we all just have to galvanize around this left-wing platform because we're living in existential circumstances, and we're in this pre-genocidal moment, and people became very, I don't want to say hysterical, but certainly there was a lot of high-strung emotions both with his elections. And what was astonishing to me was that it didn't ever seem to abate, right? That even years into his presidency, when it became clear that a lot of his more caustic rhetoric was not going to lead to any draconian policy measures, and the ones that he had taken were undoubtedly, harmful for the Muslim community. It wasn't, as bad as some of the worst prognostications had made out. Nevertheless, even after his electoral loss last year, none of that's been revisited. Right. And so even now, under a Democratic president that has, I actually thought Biden was going to govern as more of a centrist. He hasn't, actually. He's governed as more of a leftist, someone who's probably been somewhere in between establishment Democrats and the far left progressives. He's kind of moved, he shifted the Overton window of the Democratic Party dramatically in the left direction, but it doesn't seem to have recalibrated any of those prior political assumptions in any serious way.
What strikes me as a little confusing is that, looking in the big picture, it seems to me that the Muslim activist alliance with the political left comes at a great price. It may be that these leaders we're referring to privately believe what Islam teaches, but it's more of a calculating position. Well, this is the way to go forward. We have to appease these groups. We'll say the right thing. But it strikes me the traditional right. I don't mean the economic liberal right. I mean the traditional right has many positions on social, cultural, moral issues that are pretty much the same as the Islamic position, whether it be on traditional marriage, whether it be on law and order, the place of religion itself in public life, having a role to play in informing the legislature, and many other issues. The right seems to be also a natural constituency for Muslims. But as you say, because of the Islamophobic rhetoric and occasional racism as well, this complicates the whole matter. But it seems to me that the Muslim position is not naturally a left-wing one at all. On the contrary.
No, and if Muslims are going to find class with people on social issues, it's probably not going to be in the political arena, right? If it's going to be conservative religious actors, it's going to be religious groups and organizations that exist outside of politics. So there may be Mormon groups or even Catholic groups like the Catholic Women's Forum and others who are much closer to those to us on those types of issues. So if Muslims are going to collaborate with somebody on these types of issues, those are the organizations that they're going to do it with. They're not going to do it with Mitch McConnell or somebody, right? Right? Like, or Ted Cruz or something. That they're going to do it with one of them, right? And so, now Muslims haven't really made social morality a major political, social, or cultural concern of theirs at all. Now, they have cared enough about some of these social issues such that they become important topics locally at the community level, right? And so you'll have at the local mosque or at the local Muslim community a lot of dialogue around issues like marriage and divorce and raising children and things like that. Certainly many imams and Islamic schools and others are really struggling with the LGBT question overall. And
it's the same in the UK as well. I know plenty of people who have young children very, very concerned about what their children are going to be taught in these schools. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's a huge issue here. Just about every mosque of any significance, and even small mosques now, are dealing with this issue at a real level. But what you don't have is any guiding narrative. You don't have any efforts that have been done.
You mean from the Muslim leaders, you mean?
Absolutely, yeah. Or even leading Muslim institutions. Most of them have shied away from this issue for varying reasons. And so, if a Muslim today is worried about this, as many Muslims are, right? Like Muslim parents, you're a Muslim parent, you're worried about what's going on in your local school district. You basically have to assume that you're on your own today, for the most part. I don't think that you can assume that you have the support of your local mosque, because most of them will not come out on this. You cannot assume that you'll have the support of local Muslim leaders.
Why not? Let's be clear. Why won't Muslim leaders speak out or just lead? I think they can lead in a sensitive, suitably nuanced and caveated way. They don't have to be firebrands. Why can't they?
I agree. I am in complete agreement with you. I think that there is space for Muslims to come out and just sort of dispassionately and forthrightly state Islam's positions on morality and right and wrong and all of that, and say, look, like we're people who live here, our children go to these schools, we're invested in these issues as well, and we don't want to see our children indoctrinated by your liberal fashions or your narratives about sex and gender that differ markedly with our commitments as people of faith, right? Like we should actually say that, and we shouldn't be apprehensive about saying that. Yeah. But I think part of it.
Speaking out there. I mean, I'm not trying to be naive here, but
no. I think
why is there such an absence? According to your own testimony, there's a void of leadership. Why is there such a void?
Well, I think this issue has become such a caustic issue in the public square, right? It's kind of one of those issues where there is very little tolerance for dissenting opinions or voices, right? I mean, you look at what happens to seemingly powerful quote unquote figures like J.K. Rowling or Dave Chappelle, and then you look at the mirror at yourself as this, immigrant community that feels disempowered and already is being targeted by various political policies that seem to single out the Muslim community. You ask yourself, do I need to do I need to create problems for myself, right? And so I think that's partly to blame. I think the other part of it is that a lot of Muslims have grown comfortable with and grown to like the feeling of inclusion that left-wing spaces provide them. And they recognize that inclusion will be jeopardized in rather significant ways if they make their positions on homosexuality and transgenderism clear. And so they are not wont to, compromise relationships and alliances that have been developed over the course of the last decade or so. And many of these people are now, in this. I think that's a major issue, right? I think that's a huge issue. And when the condition for your alliances, either as a formal matter or as de facto understood between multiple parties, is that you are not going to advance in even the most local of capacities your beliefs on a subset of issues that are really key issues in Islam, right? We're not talking about like fada'i or ancillary questions of Islam that really aren't pressing issues of the day, but we're talking about something that's really affecting and impacting your community. Well, I don't think there's much to respect about that type of compromise.
Okay. Well, thank you. That's you mentioned briefly transgenderism, that whole issue, and perhaps we can now move into the question of gender and gender identities. And I personally find this very confusing. I mean, I'm told we hear all the time that gender is a social construct, it's a product of culture, our upbringing, our parents, whatever. And then, but I also hear scientists saying that gender is biologically determined. It's passed on through our DNA, no less. And this feeds into the whole debate about transgenderism. So could you just tell me what is gender and what does Islam say about gender as well, if you wouldn't mind?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of things to mention about that. I think that probably begins by trying to understand contemporary contentions over the topic of gender. So many gender critical writers, gender theorists, talk about the invention of gender, the same way we might talk about the invention of homosexuality. And they say that gender was crafted and constructed as a 20th century intellectual contribution. And that prior to that, we did not have the concept of gender the way we do today. Right. So they say it was invented for various psychopathological reasons, the same way that the sexuality was invented, and that ended up bringing into the world, right, these various gender categories and gender dichotomizing so much of our thinking and so on and so forth. I don't really buy that, right? I think whether or not, if a person believes gender, as many contemporary gender theorists do, that gender refers to the way in which we perform our sexual identities, meaning that we are male and female, and what it means to be a male, what it means to be a female is brought into the world through a public performance that is refracted through a set of social expectations. And those social expectations and the behavior that aligns to it, or the performance that's associated to it, is what gender is, right? Is what gender is. Well, I think there is, I think at minimum, the concepts of male and female, which is a transhistorical concept. I mean, just about every single human society since time immemorial has had that sort of bifurcation of the male and the female.
It's not just that, is it? I look at, I mean, I don't know much about biology and nature and so on, but I remember Andrew Sullivan wrote an article, The American Critic. In fact, you referenced it in one of your papers. He said, if you look at the world of nature, you get very clear male and female dichotomies. The male chimp, the male whatever, is very different from the female one. Is it the case that our species is totally unique in the history of the world, of all the other species on Earth, in having no gender distinctions at all, and they be entirely social constructs? But the implication is surely not, that we are, like the animal kingdom, we also have this binary reality, the male and the female.
Yeah. And if one looks at the way in which the terms male and female are deployed, certainly in the Islamic tradition, but any other tradition, it's doing the work of gender, right? Meaning it's doing the work of the way that people think about gender today, which is simply to say that people didn't simply think of sex as a biological phenomenon that was purely arbitrary.
No.
And had no correspondence to the differences between men and women in their societies. Rather, they regarded those two as inherently connected, right? That you couldn't have one without the other. That if men and women were not simply differentiated physiologically and biologically, they were differentiated behaviorally in many profound ways.
And psychologically, the mind, and
psychologically, and
so on. Yeah,
absolutely right. I mean, the perhaps most common, or one of the most intuitive differences between men and women that still seems to have some applicability in our society is the difference between a father and a mother, right? That a father, when we distinguish or we speak about fathers and we speak about mothers, we're not simply talking about, a paternal and a maternal relationship. We're not just talking about a blood relationship to a child. we are talking about that, but we're talking about more than that in most contexts. When we talk about someone behaving in a motherly way, we understand intuitively what that means, that there's something about maternal life that I think connects with people, because normatively speaking, in the vast majority of circumstances, we understand what it means. Like there's something that we cherish in most societies about motherhood, and about the love and empathy and concern and care that motherhood brings into the world of a child, and that a child, even late in life, will honor, right? The best of us will honor our mothers. We will honor motherhood because we recognize how important and fundamental it has been to not only our own lives, but really to the societies in which we live. Likewise with fatherhood, right? And what fatherhood means in terms of paternal care and providing and nurturing in a markedly different way, though nonetheless identifiable, right? And now the sort of gender critical response to that would be, well, that's just social expectation. What's happened is that you've crafted a particular role for the woman that just so happens to have a biological relationship to this child, and you've created a certain sexed or gendered stereotype for the male in that same relationship, and you've given them terms, right? So you've given them labels. This one's a father, this one's a mother. In fact, there is no necessary relationship that we have to hold ourselves to simply through biological relations, right? Even there's some that even question these categories of mother and father. Even Judith Butler extends this to the category of woman, right? The sort of category of women is just this invention that we brought together and we brought into the world through repeated performance. And so what happens is you get this entire plasticity of gender. Everything becomes liquid, and I find that entire narrative so utterly fantastical and off the reservation.
Well, this is all wonderful theory, and I'm sure there are lots of professors in Ivy League universities talking about this from the humanities side. Yeah. But what is science saying? What's behavioral genetics saying?
Yeah.
I mean, because we know, I've got books behind me here written by leading justices on the contribution, our understanding of DNA now and the role it plays in who we are as human beings in terms of our behavior, our intelligence, our height, our eye color, but our personalities. And, more than just the obvious skin color issues, it's much deeper.
Oh, you're right. You're right. So, in fact, even thickness of skin and, brain differences. I mean, you're right. Vascular patterns, and there's so many differences.
Personalities. I've inherited stuff from my father, my uncle, and so. So, what is science saying about this whole issue?
Well, what you're getting is, unfortunately, is even in sort of the natural sciences, increasingly they're capitulating to this gender critical and transgender movement, and so you've had some very, very significant developments there. I want to say the New England Journal of Medicine came out with gender being purely a social construct, and they had some official statement about that. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, they also had recommendations against identifying gender at birth. Now, you've had other groups that are, the natural sciences that have done the same thing.
But Mobeen, I'm asking about behavioral genetics here.
Oh, yeah. No.
What doctors think? Oh, doctor thinks. Oh, yeah. But what is hard science telling us? What's DNA telling us?
Oh, no question. Look, I think the hard science, and it's interesting because you can't totally abandon that work, because so much of it is important, right? I mean, even COVID, to a large extent, you've had so much research that's been done and differentiated on the basis of sex. So how are men and women responding to treatments? How are they responding to illness? It's different, right? They're not identical. Yeah. They're distinguished on that basis. And so in some ways, you have this reemergence and resurgence of the significance of male and female difference in those domains. And so you're right, like even biologicals, anybody, even those who deal with gender psychology, have very, very tough time totally abandoning gender. They just can't get away from it. And obviously, the more we study it, the more we learn about just how profound and widespread our differences are. Exactly. A common example that I bring up is an example that actually a lot of feminists bring up to problematize the notion of gender. And that example, which is one of the most commonly mentioned ones, has to do with color preferencing. And the reason that comes up a lot is because it is viewed as an area that has been disproportionately oppressive to young girls. Because what's happened is they've been raised with a certain type of color preferencing. They keep being fed pink, pink, pink. And as a result of that, they're being nurtured into these very ditzy, stereotypes, effeminate, sort of unsophisticated modes of living. And they're not being viewed fully as human the same way boys are, right? Boys are being given, blue. And so, you have you have masculine modes of thinking and behavior that are associated with that. And so men, even from the youngest of ages, have a leg up in various ways, whereas women have a leg down. And so now gender preferencing, and you had a study that was produced that said that gender preferencing was a 20th century invention of the West. And that, prior to the Western 20th century, the blue-pink dichotomy really had no material reality in any human society. And even today, when you get beyond Western society.
So just to clarify, this study showed a while ago, purported to show anyway, that the typical stereotype preference of a girl for pink and the stereotypical boy preference for blue is just a Western cultural thing. It's not universal, purely engendered, and we should free ourselves, this implicit message presumably, from these rigid color-coded realities, and that's what this study purported to show some time ago. But there's been some news since then, perhaps.
Yeah, there has. And so one of the things that's happened is you've had really credible psychopathologists that have followed up on that study and done subsequent ones. A big name in this has been Marco Del Giudice, or Giudice, Guidice, I believe. This is how he spells his last name, where, totally questioned the basis of that study and actually proceeded to show that the picture is actually a lot more murky and complicated when it comes to gender preferencing. And one of the challenges that we have with gender preferencing is just how stable gender preferencing is across societies, right? Absolutely.
But is that true?
No,
is it just contemporary?
No, not. And this is one of the things like again, it's very tough to go back because your available evidence becomes more limited. But his entire point is that, gender preferencing isn't nearly as arbitrary as we might think. Certainly there are social elements that factor into it, but like most things, it's probably some combination of nurture and nature. That it is not purely nurture alone. It's very difficult to make that argument on the basis of the evidence. And in fact, he refers to that sort of pink-blue dichotomy study as science fiction. And he's very critical of that study, just on the basis of its own output and methods and everything else. And so, the lack of reproducibility and all of that. But anyway, the reason I bring that up is that initial study continues to get cited, right? It continues to get cited as if it is dogma, right? And it, a lot of feminists and gender critical thinkers and others don't seem to stick around for the debate when their own attitudes and ideas begin to get questioned.
But there are some great honourable exceptions. There's Germaine Greer, who perhaps is a Brit, although she's from Australia originally. Camille Paglia, who very idiosyncratic. I say idiosyncratic.
Oh yes, very. You're right. Yeah.
In the obvious block, really. Who are outspoken defenders of gender, shall we say, in the sense that you would define it perhaps, and also very critical of this whole transgender movement, the idea that gender can be as well. In that regard, I came across an article, I just want to share it with you today. It's in the today's Times, the London Times, about ministers face a public backlash over gender recognition reform plans. I just read, it's fascinating. Scottish ministers here in the UK are facing a massive public backlash over their planned gender recognition forms, according to a poll. Now, a poll was done, 3/4 of people in Scotland oppose the plan, which is this: to let people officially change their gender quickly without providing any medical evidence of gender dysphoria. Ministers plan to allow trans people to apply for a gender recognition certificate after just declaring they have lived in their acquired gender for 3 months. Now, that this is produced, according to the Times, a big outcry. So the idea is now that if I wake up one day, right, I'm a woman, and after 3 months, I will be able to change my gender legally, and the police, everyone will have to say, yep, I'm a woman now. This has produced a huge backlash apparently from the Scottish people, which is very interesting. So, but that seems to be a very extreme view that gender is so detached from any physical, biological components at all. It's purely a decision of the mind. I find that extraordinary.
Yeah, no, I mean you're absolutely right. And what's well, I guess part of the challenge here is that when you don't have a clear sort of set of metaphysical commitments that human beings can galvanize around, the question is, why shouldn't we let people make those types of choices? Right? That's sort of the secular cage. If you're not able to bring substantive commitments to the table about the meaning of what it means to be a male and a female, in some ways, the question is, well, why is it your problem? You don't have to change your gender. Why do you want to stop other people from changing theirs? Right? Who's it harming? Right? So now we get back to the harm principle. And so in some ways, I guess if we are even looking at this through a higher order critique, we could say that some of what we're dealing with is just the entailments of secular modernity, right? You abandon God, right? You make your societies plastic.
You abandon morality. There's no transcendent to your moral discourse. Ethics are ultimately invention. You invent right and wrong. The famous British philosopher John Mackey wrote actually a book called Ethics, Inventing Right and Wrong, and he was an atheist, by the way. And
everything's being socially negotiated, and it's all power and the prejudice and patriarchy and all of that. Well, where does it harm you, right? At what point should you have the right to impose on other people or limit their ability to freely act in a way that's commensurate with their own desires, right? And so that becomes, so who cares? 3/4 of people don't want to do it, right? That's just their opinion. They don't have to do it, right? Leave it open to the 1/4 who do. That'll be the type of argument that you get as a counter. Now, obviously, part of our challenge is trying to bring forward the fact that these are not harmless activities, that what you're doing is not merely accommodating gender atypical expression, but you're inducing gender atypical behaviors. And when gender atypical behaviors and mentalities and attitudes and identities become prevalent and popularized, what you get is a pathological, psychologically dysfunctional society. And a lot of the evidence points to that. Certainly in transgenderism, you have very high rates of suicide and suicidality that accompanies it. You now have this whole discourse around desistance. I mean, even within medical spaces now, you have a number of very prominent cases. What's her name? Keisha Bell, I want to say, who in the UK had sued the National Health Service, NHS, and won a very, very significant case against the National Health Service for having transitioned her at a time when she was confused and dealing with anxieties and depression, and all of her problems in life had been reduced by her therapist and psychologist to her gender, and that she was just in the wrong gender. She was actually a male. That's all it was, and it was sort of comforting for her to think that that's all the problem was. And yet, after all of the transitioning, she came to realize that it was a huge mistake, that she was not in the right psychological or emotional state to make that type of decision, and the actual clinic that performed it lost the case, right? Which was extremely rare, right, for those types of cases to even be heard. It was in the British High Courts, and she won her case against them. It was the Tavistock Clinic, I believe, that she successfully sued and won her case.
They're a very, very prominent, well-established, revered medical kind of agency. So they're not a fringe one at all, the Tavistock.
Oh, yeah. No, and they, on this particular issue, were one of the leading ones, right, in terms of conducting gender transition surgeries and procedures and all of that. And so, and then, when you induce gender confusion, not only in when you do it in adults, that starts transitioning and you begin to affect children. And so now you have more and more children that become gender confused, and children are not sort of suave, detached adults that can sort of see dysfunctional discourses and just recognize them from outside.
I never yet to meet a suave, detached adult, by the way.
I know.
Maybe they live in America, but there aren't many of suave, detached adults.
You're right.
In London, I tell you.
But many people have a very distorted view of children and how impressionable children are, and the type of influences that really change child behavior. And many children have a very tough time with all of this. And so the toll is bore out by our children, by our young people, because we don't have adults who have the courage to stand up and say, hey, this really needs to be, like, there needs to be an intervention here to really bring this back to some realm of sanity, right? Like, we can't simply stand pat while our entire conception of male and female differences are being upended in this way.
I'm quite pessimistic. I think there's an expression, riding the tiger. The sense that I think our civilization is going down this dark hole, and I don't think there's anything that we can do about it. I don't mean to be pessimistic, but
no. I mean, I'm not a far departure from where you are on this. It's interesting to me because one of the big points of debate today is sports. Female sports and female athletics. And I actually think that is actually an indication of just how far along we are. And if there's a reason to be pessimistic, I think that's one of them. That, you've kind of given up in so many areas that are more meaningful to human participation than sports. I mean, athletics is really not, one of the most pivotal, critical areas of any human society. It's entertainment at most. Right, it may be some personal feat or achievement at play, but for the most part, sports has far less meaning than parenthood, or family and what a family means. It has far less meaning than marriage, right? It has far less meaning than just being men and women in society, right? And so many other spaces and places, and yet all of those have effectively been conceded. Right, all of those have been conceded, and the one area where people are starting to put their foot down is sports. But sports just shows you how far along they are, and that you're already on a back footing. Right, you're already on your back foot, and you're just trying to push back and hold it together. And so, what you have to do is basically appeal to the most absurd instances of where gender denial becomes, just really brazen. Right, that's what you have to do, but it's in some ways it shows the weakness of your position that you have to do that.
I think I'm just expressing my pessimism there. Hopefully, it was more kind of realism than pessimism. But that we're not about just to turn the corner and everyone's about to wake up tomorrow and realize what mess we're in, and that we've got to go back to more traditional social arrangements with men and women. I just don't see that in the wind. Of course, only God knows the future, and God knows best, and God is in control. Of course. But the point is this: that what is the Muslim, and it's the same question for Christians, traditional Jews, and even traditional secular people. What is the strategy in the meantime? Is it to hunker down, basically, protect our families, protect our community, protect our mosques, try and keep the integrity of the faith going faithfully by prayer and fasting and so on, rather than changing the world? Is that the strategy that while we wait for the end? I mean,
no. Well, I think our strategy is effectively similar, irrespective of the context that we find ourselves in, which is that we as Muslims have an obligation, moral obligation, to stand for the truth. And we stand for it in whatever capacity we can, right? And we try to do so with wisdom and beautiful preaching, and in a way that's going to resonate with our interlocutors and those who have differences with us. We continue to go back to the work of persuasion as best we can. We leverage whatever modes and mediums are available for us to try to get that message across. We may or may not be successful in doing so, right? Even people who are, numerical majorities are not always successful in trying to, impose their beliefs or ideas on others. We obviously aren't in a position where we can do that. We're in a position where we can try our best to at least make our position clear and known and reasonable and apprehensible and comprehensible to people who don't get it every day. And where the cards fall, they fall where they may, right? We let them fall, but we try to make sure that as part of that society, we are always distinguished by our commitment to the truth, by our commitment to upholding God's guidance and making it clear to others. In fact, you have, one of the really important passages here in the Quran is a passage where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the people of the Sabbath. And the people of the Sabbath were tested, as the famous story goes, with the fish, right? They're able to fish every day. They're not permitted to cast out their nets on the Sabbath. And yet the fish are out in abundance on the Sabbath. They are not as abundant on the other days. And so what you have are people who are trying to now circumvent the Sabbath, right? And the laws of the Sabbath. And so they put out their nets the night before, they collect them after the Sabbath, and they're doing this repeatedly as a way to circumvent God's prohibition. And in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about two groups of people that don't do that. You have one group of people that tries to warn the ones that are violating the command. And they tell them not to do it, and that, don't you remember that? And they're reminding them. And you have another group of people that has basically said that they're those people that are circumventing God's laws, they're lost. They're lost, right? Why are you wasting your breath? Right? And in one verse of the Quran, they basically say that to the others. They say, why are you wasting your breath on them? Right? Like they're not going to change. And the people who are warning, they respond to them and they say, ma'adhiratan ila rabbikum, that we may be forgiven in front of your Lord. Right? That we may be forgiven by God. وَلَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَّقُونَ, and that perhaps those people will become conscientious of God. That they may become pious through hearing this. It's a possibility. And we don't give up on that possibility, nor do we give up on our own need of God's forgiveness, right? We want people around us to achieve God's grace and to receive God's grace and His mercy, to find salvation in the hereafter, to be in the company of the Prophet ﷺ. We desire good for them. And anyone who desires good for other people is not going to stand pat while they're doing things that are destructive and counterproductive and unhealthy and harmful for their well-being, both in this life and in the next. And so that's where our concern should always lie, and that's what should guide our actions, even if it means that we pay some cost along the way. If it's going to make us social pariahs just for saying our beliefs, well, we don't stop saying our beliefs for that reason. Right? Thankfully, we are not living in societies where we're going to be arrested just for saying what we believe. Right? There are Muslims in some countries today where that is the case. Right? That is the case. You have countries in the world today where Muslims cannot freely go and attend the mosque and pray and all of that. Right? That's not the societies that we're in. We have societies that have granted us a lot of latitude and a fair degree of freedom, by which we can stand up and stand for our beliefs and values. And look, I mean, that's what happened in the UK, right? With the protests over RSE and the whole gender teaching, where you had Muslim parents who were very upset, and rightfully so, about the type of indoctrinating classrooms and teachings that were making their way into their schools and the schools of their children. And they didn't want their children being taught that stuff. They said no. They said no, and I think that's an example for us where they didn't do anything illegal, right? They stood up, and these were mothers, and these were Muslim fathers and Muslim parents who said that we're not going to stand back while you teach our children things that we believe to be fundamentally wrong and that are wrong, right? We're not going to stand pat for that. And so they stood up for themselves, and they were able to achieve certain things because they did so, right? And now those schools are more sensitive to Muslim children, and Muslim parents themselves probably now understand that we've got to probably invest a lot more in Islamic schools, right? And potentially homeschooling, and we've got to do a lot of this, because even if we've held it off for right now, we know what's going on, and we've made clear.
I mean, without naming schools, of course, I happen to know anecdotally from someone who's in a position to know that there are Islamic schools in the UK, in London, I guess, which do formally conform outwardly to Ofsted. This is the government's education inspectorate in their requirements in this area, but actually unofficially they teach Islamically correct teaching when it comes to these areas. So there is an external conformity, but the reality is they actually do teach Islam. So that's a kind of a more complicated
It is. I mean, that's always temporary, right? It's only a matter of time before you get discovered or found out. I think that groups like that need to be focused on trying to figure out how they can, be forthright and transparent about what they are teaching, and not feel like they have to be clandestine about their own beliefs, right? and the way their schools are functioning. That's my own position. I don't think. I just think that that's obviously not a very. That's just not the best context to be in, right? As a school, so the best situation to be in, I should say. Yeah.
Okay. Well, perhaps drawing to conclusion there with that, some beautiful words there from you, Mobeen, about God's mercy and always looking for people to turn and come back to the truth, and just to keep on bearing witness to the truth in increasingly difficult times, because that's what all people of faith are called to witness to the truth, and not just to go along with the prevailing fashions, which are always changing. The quicksands of modernity it's just exhausting, because in next year, what's going to be, in 5 years' time, will it be interspecies relationships? Will it be the virtues of incest, or the so on? I mean, this all sounds fanciful, but 10 years ago, gay marriage was unthinkable. So,
no, you're right. I mean, it's something that today people would laugh at, and they'd say that you're right. I mean, it's interesting, because transgenderism is so new. You have so much media material that's out there from just 10 or 15 years ago, of even liberal pundits saying things that today are totally transphobic, right? That are regarded as transphobic, but just a decade ago were seen as the unquestioned dominant position of even far left actors and thinkers, right? And so Jon Stewart and this person, that person, saying, just making fun of this whole thing, right?
Yeah.
And pillorying it, and it was always a joke topic, right? It wasn't ever taken as something that would become a social cause of its own.
You can still find bits of Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama criticizing gay marriage. No, not on my watch. No, gay marriage is not going to happen in the Democrat Party.
Yeah.
No, it's the enforced orthodoxy. Yeah, you can still find it online.
Oh, no question. Yeah, I mean, I remember Dennis. I believe it was Dennis Kucinich, who was asked a question about the Supreme Court justice and whether he would nominate a gay Supreme Court justice. And his response to that was something along the lines of that he wouldn't discriminate on any basis, race, religion, sexual orientation, or gender. He said, or even if they're transgender, right? Said that. Now, Dennis Kucinich at the time was a sort of obscure candidate, one of the people that's on the Democratic nomination platform, but on the far left or far right, and is polling at 1% or 2% type of thing. He wasn't a terrible politician in all of his views, but I still remember when he said that, it just became a punchline for so many late night shows.
Wow!
Like it was just a big joke that they were bringing that up. And, the Daily Show made mention of it, Leno and all these people, they just totally pilloried it as a big joke.
Wow.
And now these are people who suddenly now have, found Jesus on the transgender issue. And, now all of that, I mean, people are being canceled and written off for saying far less. I mean, J.K. Rowling talking about womanhood means that she's transphobic, even though she's probably pro-trans in any number of areas.
Yeah, she's far from being right-wing or traditionalist.
Yeah. And yet now she has become a symbol in the face for what trans-critical positions, which again goes back to what we were discussing about
people like Jermaine Korean, who historically was seen as radical feminists and dangerous subversives, are now on the right, and yet they haven't changed. Their views are exactly the same.
And many of these people aren't.
All the way
And they're not opposed to anything within transgender. They're not opposed to social transitioning, hormone therapy, sex reassignment, sex change surgeries. They're not opposed to any of that. What they're opposed to is saying that trans women are women. That's where their limit is, or trans men are men. So you can say whatever you want. You just can't say they're the same. That's basically the line that they draw. And even that line is now the transphobic line, right? The trans exclusionary radical feminist line. Which again goes back to what we were discussing. So
what we're talking about is, I mean, what are your predictions for the future? And what's the next taboo to become not only mainstream and normal, but then obligatory to say nice things about?
I don't know. I mean, it's tough. It's tough to prognosticate, only because we're living in very volatile times. And so even when you're thinking pessimistically, one of the things that is really remarkable is just how quickly you can have a fringe movement, even a minority group, that is committed to a particular platform or position and is passionate about it and is able to actually move the needle nationally and sometimes internationally on issues through sustained and concerted effort. And so the very fact that that happens, I think, tells you that things can go any number of ways. If I'm going to talk about more proximately, sort of in the near term, I think certainly in the US, I don't know about the UK, but certainly in the US, I think the next issue here that's already growing into this is sex work.
You mean prostitution?
Yeah, prostitution. Yeah, so prostitution, and I think what we're going to see, and certainly Allah knows best, if I'm being a cynic here, is that I think you're going to have. Well, I think you're already seeing porn companies using the language of sex work to describe people who put up videos and material on their sites. I think one of the challenges that internet pornography has had, obviously, is just the proliferation of free pornography. And so their profit potential only gets to a certain point because they can't, it's very difficult to monetize pornography, I imagine, simply because, why would people pay for something that they can Google for free, right? Yeah. And so the next phase of that, to me, is potentially the sex work legalization effort where you can have pornography, which is already burgeoned and the largest available activity on the internet. But now the idea becomes, okay, I'm sort of sexually interested at this moment in this person whose videos I'm following, and now as a porn company, I not only can offer for you videos, but I can offer for you nights with that person at a cost. And so you get something akin to almost like an Uber, right? but for sex work and prostitution, where the videos become the connection to me actually getting an in-person night, and you have a cost structure associated with that and all of that. And once it's sanctionable, this could actually be seen as a mode of progress, because what you're doing is providing women the means by which they can transact of their own body. You're increasing their commercial prospects. You're giving them the ability to have more agency over themselves, and you have these porn companies and others that effectively become digital pimps. I think if I'm being a cynic, I think that's certainly a possibility.
Well, you've outlined a clear rationale for it. You've outlined a clear business case and a kind of pseudo-intellectual justification for it in terms of empowering women to do all this stuff, which is obviously rubbish because it just damages and coarsens. And
I mean, there is no limit to what can be justified in the name of independence, agency, capitalist consumerism, and sort of the neoliberal self, and the person who's able to become a financially productive citizen, right? I mean, there's really very little limit to that. And so I think that if you just look at what's happened, I think a lot of online porn is probably hitting its limits, and this becomes the next phase of, the sort of prostitution space becomes the next development for them. And I think, look, this is already a pet cause of a lot of liberals. I mean, certainly in the United States, you've even had Muslims who are running for political office who are now pro-legalization of sex work, and so they're on sort of the far left on these types of issues. Many Muslim activists now are pro this, and it's only a matter of time now where it maybe just given how fast things are moving, maybe an election or two where suddenly sex work becomes it's gonna have a couple of losses, right? You always have to lose a couple of election cycles, but the whole point is that it's now already in motion, and you have very powerful actors that are interested in seeing this get legalized. So,
rich men, presumably, who want to monetize the women that they can, who are desperate enough to do this. I mean, in the British press, the mainstream British press at the time, so I have noticed this expression "sex workers" being used, and I remember thinking, what on earth does that mean? Oh, you mean prostitution? So, but as soon as you start using this language, because they're workers, of course, then why can't workers work and ply their trade legally and in an acceptable way that's monetized? The very language leads to the justification of that activity.
And even they're very specific on their words and language, right? So they create this distinction between the legalization of sex work and the decriminalization of sex work. And so their sort of framing of this is that the legalization of sex work makes it the preserve of public institutions. And so it's now the federal government that has, the same way that the federal government might decide what counts as a marriage, you have the federal government that's now deciding what sex work is and isn't. What we want is it to be a bit more libertarian, right? We want a context in a social setting where women have total ownership over their bodies and themselves. And so that's what decriminalization is. The decriminalizing sex work says that women can do what they want without being subject to criminal prosecution.
I'm just to bring in an Islamic flavor here, but I'm just struck the language you're using is the direct antithesis, almost the satanic opposite of the proper way of looking at it, because human beings don't own their own bodies. They are creations of God. God owns our bodies, and He has given us ways to live for our own benefit, for our own flourishing, which certainly doesn't include legalizing prostitution as a social
well, most moderns have already bought into my body, my choice. Most of them have already bought into that, their abortion and everything else. And so this is not, this is totally in keeping with that.
True.
And then, all you're going to have is, the people who are leading this have to be oppressed minorities, right? And a lot of the framing of the why is prostitution prohibited? It's prohibited because of patriarchy
and religion,
and Western modernity and colonialism and this and that. And so becoming this post-colonial modern actor requires me to adhere to the intersectional platform, which is inclusive of women, and essential to those women's concerns is ownership over their own bodies, and men not being allowed to tell them what they are allowed to and not allowed to do with it. And so, if the largest companies that suddenly are, or the largest lobbyists and organizations that are pushing for the decriminalization of sex work are led by minority women, suddenly it becomes something that has even more social and cultural cachet, right? And what's going to happen is what's happened with homosexuality, which is what groups are going to oppose it. It's going to be right-wing conservative groups. What's going to happen then? Muslims are going to be very leery of them, and they're going to say, "Oh, we don't want to take the right-wing conservative position. God forbid we do that. We have to deal with enough Islamophobia and this and that. And so we're just going to be mum on the question of sex work because it's not our issue." And then it's the same. It's the same script in some ways, right?
Yeah, it's the same script in India. But of course, even traditionalists of any background believe in the common good, the idea that, we're not just individuals and minorities, we are part of a public organism, society, and we look after the public health and not kowtow to extremist narratives, which are constantly telling us to reinvent ourselves.
Yeah, what we need are those traditionalists to actually exhibit some mettle, right? Which unfortunately one of the unhealthy or unhelpful certainly predispositions, I'll say, of the traditionalists today is a inclination towards insularity, right? A lot of traditionalists incline towards retreating from society and not being invested in any public discussion or discourse. It's more important just to focus on yourself and your household, etc. Right? And self-reform, right?
Well, there is virtue in self-reform and not just throwing yourself in the walls all the time. But I reminded someone's eminence is Sir Roger Scruton, a British philosopher, public intellectual who sadly recently passed away. He had a wonderful conversation with Sheikh Hamza Yusuf at the Zaytuna Institute, which you can watch online. The guy used to be quite Islamophobic, but I think he's softened a lot over the years. Anyway, he was a traditionalist, like the traditionalist in the UK, I guess. But you should have seen his life, the way he was deplatformed, the way he was persecuted, basically, the way the New Statesman, as an eminent left-wing journal here, wrote an article defaming and lying about him, about a whole bunch of stuff. And he lost his prestigious post with the British government over this, who just dropped him, even though the article was based on lies. We know it's based on lies because Scruton said it was a load of rubbish, and the journal themselves admitted ultimately that it was a bunch of lies because, well, I won't go into the details, but they did. But the way they treated him, so I'm not surprised that if someone like that could be taken down, the big beast, anyone could be taken down.
Of course, and a lot of Muslims, especially traditionalists, do have a very defeatist attitude, sort of fatalistic attitude towards their societies, right? Like we're just living in times of kufr and in Dar al-Kufr, and we're sort of at the end of times, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of end times jargon as well.
That's right.
Yeah, and so what do you do in the end of times? You hearken down and you focus on yourself and self-reform and self-reflection. You just worship God and you die on that, and that's all that kind of matters. You give up the public work, right? And so, when that becomes such a common appeal, right, and response to the challenges of modernity by traditionalists, you don't really have you don't have enough people who are actually raising their voices, certainly not in the Muslim community, right? So,
but you're not one of those people. You're one of those who thinks we should. You alluded to the Quranic passage anyway.
Obviously, I don't think you're going to be left alone. Right? I just don't think. Right? They're not leaving you alone. They're just not. They've shown you that they're not leaving you alone. And so the more you try to be left alone, the more you're going to be impinged upon.
Right.
And at some point, it's already becoming more and more aggressive. It's becoming more and more invasive. At some point, when you finally recognize it, it's going to be too late.
Yeah.
Right.
Because they're asking for tolerance first of all, then they ask for their rights. Now they're asking for absolute conformity and consent, submission to that. So it's no longer just let us have our rights. No. Now you must agree with our agenda publicly, and if you don't, we will go after you and deplatform you or prosecute you or demonize you, whatever.
And we have to be honest about what world are we living in, right? Where is the escapability for most parents and children? I mean, if you have a child today,
Mobeen, what about Hijra? I mean, just throw that out there. Why not Hijra?
I mean, that's an option. I mean, I'm not dismissive of Hijra. It's certainly a possibility. And, Muslim countries are far behind on this issue. Yeah. Even liberal Muslim countries are still not. I mean, I've been surprised the UAE and Saudi and some of them recently have pushed back against LGBT media being introduced in their countries. And so on some of these issues, they are not nearly where the United States is. Nevertheless, even if you want to make Hijra, right, or you are still invested in trying to curtail these movements because they're global, right? And because of if we're talking about Western hegemony, one of its most powerful modes of imposition on the globe is its media output, right? Western media, Western politics, Western norms,
foreign aid, Western military,
absolutely, all of that suddenly gets tethered to your conformity to the latest dictates of gender and sexuality and everything else, which is already happening. Yeah. And so the fact is that by you not saying something, you're not only undermining your ability to subsist in your own societies, you're undermining the ability of Muslims in Muslim majority lands to actually subsist in their own, unencumbered and uncorrupted by the advances of these movements. And so, if you're just going to move there, it's going to be a matter of time before that issue gets introduced at greater levels and in greater degrees, in greater measure in those spaces and places. And so, if you're on the front lines here and you're doing nothing, well, then you're not only doing a disservice to yourself and your family and your communities, you're doing a disservice to your brothers and sisters around the world. And that to me is a tremendous act of betrayal, right? I mean, the type of cowardice it takes to not care about your own brethren throughout the Muslim world who are being attacked on this basis today, repeatedly. It is just unremitting, right? I mean, that to me is a huge cause for alarm. So.
Okay. Well, on that very somber and serious note, perhaps we could draw it to a close, Mobeen. Just to thank you so much for your time and your incisive intellectual analysis and your continuing contributions. There are many YouTube videos where Mobeen is discussing these as well, and his articles in his journal, in your website, I mean, sorry.
Yes.
And your blog, which I highly recommend, called Occasional Reflections. I'll link to it, as I say, in the link below, and to the 2 articles, the one on Can Islam Accommodate Homosexual Acts, and The Male is Not Like the Female. It's obviously a quote from the Quran in that title. Sunni Islam and Gender Nonconformity. They're both heavy duty academic works, but they really are worth persevering and reading through. And I know other scholars do reference your work as the definitive line or definitive analysis on these subjects. So is there anything you wanted just to say in conclusion, Mobeen, before we depart?
No, I just thanking you again for the invite. Inshallah, there's some benefit here. And, if there's anything that I stated that was good and correct, it's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Any mistakes that I made, I ask your forgiveness, the forgiveness of the audience. And it's always Allah knows best. So
absolutely. Amen to that. Amen to that. Well, thank you so much, Mobeen. I do hope people have persevered to the end of this podcast because it's certainly been worthwhile. Thank you very much. And until next time.